think as Martin Wolf wrote on ft.com yesterday, the last budget before a general election can't be a serious statement of economic policy, and of course he was right. I think it's worth going over quickly some of the UK's challenges before I comment on the budget in more detail. The immediate problem, as we've heard, is of course the 166 billion deficit. Given government spending of 674 billion this year, it means that the government is borrowing almost £1 in every 4 that it's spending. So even though the deficit's come in a bit lower than forecast, it's still a massive problem that needs a serious plan to address it. And let us not kid ourselves that the fiscal hole is not extremely deep. But on top of this immediate deficit problem, there are significant longer-term pressures on public spending. The two most prominent ones are to improve the UK's infrastructure and the ageing population. But firstly, let's talk about the ageing population. In 20 years' time, many of the baby boomers will have retired. According to the Treasury's own long-term public finance projections, in 20 years' time, this means that state pension expenditure is going to be about 0.5% of GDP higher. Public sector pension expenditure will also be about 0.5% of GDP higher. So will long-term care spending, and health spending will be a whopping 1.5% of GDP more than today. So add that up, it's about 3% of GDP more in 20 years' time, which is nearly 45 billion in today's money. And of course, with an ageing population, you've potentially got fewer workers to pay taxes for it. Secondly, the IOD and others such as Policy Exchange have set out how around 500 billion of spending will be needed to improve the UK's energy, transport, water and ICT infrastructure. These are vital investments if the UK's economic growth is to be sustained, roads and railways are not to completely clog up, and the lights are to stay on. Now interestingly, this figure was confirmed by one of the supporting documents to the budget that came out yesterday, the Strategy for National Infrastructure, which said that the demand for infrastructure investment in the UK is expected to be in the range of 40 to 50 billion a year every year until 2030. That obviously adds up to about 500 billion a decade for the next 2 decades. And the document also pointed out this is much higher than the recent historical average of about 30 billion a year. And of course it's around double where annual government investment spending is going to be in a few years' time. So put these two together, huge deficit in the short term and significant pressure on public spending in the longer term, and the UK's fiscal position looks very worrying indeed. So, some serious problems, and we might have expected a serious budget that addressed them, but of course we didn't. And public spending and tax totals are largely unchanged from the pre-budget report, very little in the way of realistic downwards revisions to the growth forecasts, and certainly no credible deficit reduction plan. We must hope that the markets are patient enough to wait for more detail on spending cuts from both of the main parties, which will probably not come out before the election. Now, to be fair, I think there were a few minor positives in the budget for businesses. One-year business rate reduction will help small firms. Doubling of the capital gains tax entrepreneurs relief to 2 million is also welcome. Doubling of the annual investment allowance to 100,000. That will help some companies, but actually most, probably their investment plans will actually, their investment spending will be less than the existing limit of 50,000. So it's not going to affect perhaps as many companies. And I think the staging of a fuel duty increase is better than nothing. But, you know, in these times it might be better not to increase fuel duty at all. So look, this is all tinkering at the edges. The big issues are still unresolved. Between 2009-10, this financial year, and the 2014-15 financial year, total public expenditure is set to go up by 98 billion. Now, of course, once inflation is taken account of, that's a much lower rise. And granted, some areas of spending within that total will face cash cuts, some areas will face rises. But overall, we've got a structural deficit of over £100 billion and public spending going up by £100 billion over the next 5 years. This has got to be madness. And while the new Green Investment Bank may help increase funding for some transport and energy projects, it doesn't go nearly far enough to address the enormous gap between the required infrastructure spending and the government's plans on net investment. And clearly a lot of new infrastructure is going to have to be financed by the private sector, but the government does really need to get its act together on this issue. We do hope that the National Infrastructure Framework that will come out of Infrastructure UK later this year will really get to grips with the issue, but we're obviously not holding our breath. So, what should be done? Well, if you're in a hole, the best thing might be to stop digging. So the first step might be to stop increasing public spending for the next few years, which would make a serious dent in the deficit. Cash freezing government spending at all levels, federal, provincial and local, for a few years was what Canada managed in the early 90s. They completely eliminated their deficit over the course of the Parliament. I think more specifically, all parties need to provide more detail on exactly what areas they're going to cut. The IOD, together with the TPA, last autumn set out a plan of 50 billion of specific savings. And the IOD recently published a plan to save 25 billion a year through improvements to government procurement and greater use of shared services and outsourcing in the public sector. Now, the procurement bit of that 25 billion represents only 7% of total government procurement expenditure, so it should be easily achievable. And imagine if a procurement director in the private sector, imagine how he would have reacted if he'd have been told he only had to make 7% savings. So that, if you add the two together, that's 75 billion of savings which you could achieve annually, and that goes most of the way towards eliminating the structural deficit. The point is not that these are exactly the right solutions, but that we need to have specific proposals coming out of the main parties that we can debate. The TPA's book, I think, has shown, it is possible to cut spending, set out the cuts you're going to make, and still win an election. So I think overall, the big story from yesterday's budget was not so much the content, but actually what was missing. And we must hope for better after the election. I think it's just a couple of final points I'd like to make. The government were very keen yesterday to talk about the dynamic effects of public spending increases. So, we spend this money and we'll get it back because of higher economic growth. Now, of course, we used to be making the arguments in better times for the dynamic effects of tax cuts, which the same people in government were quick to rubbish and say this is not true. So again, there's a very big bias in what the government are talking about towards higher expenditure, which perhaps you might expect at this stage of the electoral cycle. I think the other point worth making is actually a general election point. I'm very struck by the interview this morning with Evan Davis from the State Programme and George Osborne. Evan Davis was making the point that actually the Tories' plans are not that different from Labour. Osborne says he's going to eliminate the bulk of the structural deficit over the next Parliament, so does Alistair Darling. Osborne will do most of it through spending cuts, so will Alistair Darling. Neither party is actually putting out very much detail of what they're actually going to do. And I think that runs a risk for the Tories, because in 2005, Tories were going to increase public spending by 12 billion a year less than Labour. And Labour actually managed to create the whole cuts versus investment as a massive dividing line in that election. And the differences were pretty minor. 12 billion out of public spending of 500 billion plus is not that great a difference. And I think that the Tories risk falling into the same trap this time round, because they've not actually set out what they're going to do. Their plans are not that different from Labour's. And Labour will still talk a lot about the dividing line, investment versus cuts, and you can see that in the budget, Tories' austerity versus Labour's package for business. So, I'm not offering predictions for the election, but I think that actually, the Tories are suffering from not having put out a credible plan of their own for tackling the deficit, and I think the country really needs one.